Good morning, everyone. So my name is Bob Blackshaw. I'm going to talk a little bit about weeds this morning. So I'll talk a little bit about weed resistance and sort of an ever-increasing problem, and then we'll talk about crop staging and weed staging. And Ken's maybe going to pluck a couple of weeds out here and talk about weed ID and just the importance of all of that in terms of how we manage weeds and manage resistance. So how many of you are dealing with weed resistance?
Somewhat.
Yep. What weeds?
Wild oats and kochia.
Wild oats and kochia? Wild oats and kochia. Is the other people nodding? Anything else? Yeah. Chickweed? Okay. Yeah. So it's certainly an increasing problems. The group in Ag Canada does a weed resistance survey every 5 years in each province. So this is actually Alberta's year, will be this summer. And so they sort of track just sort of the frequency of weed resistance over time. And if we just sort of walk into a field and say, okay, what are the odds of finding a resistant weed in there? Because that's what they do. They go in August after all the applications and they pick a plant with weed seed on it, and then they take it back and they test it. So this is not someone sending in a sample where you almost get a 100% chance of it being resistant, but this is just sort of at random. And so if we went back 10 or 15 years ago, we would have had a 15 or 20% of our fields had a resistance problem. And that may just be a few patches in the field, or maybe the entire field that has a problem. So where do you think we are right now? Western Canada as sort of as a whole. Any guesses?
75.
75? Anybody else? It's about 60%. So that means 60% of all of our cropland has a weed resistance problem. And it can be small or it can be huge. And so that just sort of shows you what's happened over the timeline. Most of that resistance is due to group 1 and group 2 herbicides. And then of course we have our glyphosate resistant kochia in southern Alberta that you're probably all familiar with. And so that's our only glyphosate resistant weed that we have here. So we're sort of lucky in that regard. I think we're up to about 26 weeds in the world now that are resistant to glyphosate. So it's not abnormal, and like I say, we're lucky that it's only kochia. And I dread the day that we have wild oat that is resistant to glyphosate because we have such widespread resistance to group 1 and group 2 already. So wild oat is, that was mentioned here already, that's the most economically important weed in Western Canada, and that's the one where we have the big weed resistance problem. And it's primarily group 1s, and people knew they had a problem, they switched to group 2s, and now they've used group 2s enough years that many people have resistance to group 2 as well. So then you look at those options, and then what do we have left? So not a lot in a lot of cases. So what some people are doing, and you may be thinking about, or maybe talking about on your farm or talking about with your farmers, is trying to fit in a Treflan or an Edge or an Abidex back into your cropping systems, because in many cases they still work on those weeds. And they are not going to give you 100% control, but they can be a good start in giving you 70 to 80% control and moving along in that regard. So that's where we are in resistance. So it's not going to go away. We don't have a new herbicide on the horizon. I think it'll happen, but there's really only the major companies that are looking, and that's primarily BASF and Bayer and Syngenta. And they quote numbers of $250 million to get a new compound out there. So that means it's difficult, and they have to get return on their dollar. So they tend to key in on the major weeds, and they tend to key in on the major crops like corn and soybean and cotton and stuff like that, which isn't necessarily good news for us, because those products have to make it in those crops, and then the secondary market would be us. Secondary market would be barley. A secondary market might be canola or something like that. So that's where we're at. So now in terms of crop staging, I think we can sort of look at some plants here, but in terms of a resistance thing, we do want good weed control because resistance is a bit of a numbers game. So if you have a lot of weeds in your field, you have a greater chance of that resistant gene being present, which is maybe 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million in the population. So it's a pretty rare event. So if you only have a few weeds out there and you keep them managed, then you decrease that frequency. So you want weed control, but if you only use herbicides, then that's not necessarily a good thing, and especially if you use the same herbicide over and over again, which we've learned the hard way about that. So so we can talk about, is Ken here? Do you want to pull out a couple of weeds, Ken, and maybe we can talk about staging? I mean, when it comes to staging, I mean, that's all on the label and in the crop protection guide. That's going to tell you what staging or herbicide should be applied at in terms of the crop and in terms of the weed. I guess the only thing I can add to that is there's often a range in terms of weed stages, and we want to try and control our weeds when they're relatively small if we can. They're easier to kill when they're small, and we're protecting crop yield when they're small. So most of that damage is done by that first flush of weeds that you get. And if you wait, especially in crops that aren't very competitive like lentil and field pea and whatever, you can have a 10-15% yield loss just by waiting 10 days to spray a herbicide. So don't wait for every last weed to come up in your post-emerge sprays. Try and get a really good control of that first flush, and then if you have a good crop stand, it'll cover over and close in the canopy and shade out some weeds from here. So, and we can talk about that in this experiment here too. So Ken, you want to jump in here with a couple of weeds, and then maybe we'll talk about this experiment in terms of some differences we see in canopy closure here in canola.
Okay. So you guys are most welcome to come and walk through the plot, but I'd ask that you don't step on the canola itself. It's actually a nice little weed garden. One thing that's tricky with weeds is you look at them pretty much once a year. And it's always really difficult to get a good gauge, first of all, on ID. Like cotyledon ID is pretty challenging. We look at them every year, but it's still refreshing your mind every year. So one of the projects that I was going to mention that we're starting to assist on is an actual weed ID app that Bear is working on. It's actually available right now, although I wouldn't rely on it too heavily as we're still building the database. So just like they have at the airports, the face recognition. So if you're a terrorist, they'll ID you right away. The app actually zones in on the leaf shape. So they're trying to build a massive picture database. So all of our crew have just recently downloaded this app, and we're actually supplying the pictures that are going to help build the database so that it will be an effective tool. So it's a pretty cool tour, cool little project. You guys will be sort of the first to know about it because surprisingly they launched it. I didn't think they would, but it's launched so you can play around with it. And there might even be opportunities, like if you're a weed freak and you want to help build a database, give us a shout. We might be able to hook you up on that. But that's kind of a fun little project. Everybody's sort of, when you get out there and challenge yourself, you realize, you have a pretty good foundation, but everyone gets stumped all the time. So there's that. I've got a number of weeds here. Is anyone brave enough to ID them for me? Yeah. Shaking your head. I give you an easy one here. I personally find grassy weeds are definitely the most challenging.
It's just wheat, isn't it?
Pretty close guess, I think. So here's my trick on the cereals. I just don't have the memory to figure out all of the oracles and that sort of thing, but you can touch in on if you know some of that. I think Jamie's pretty good at it too. I just dig up the seed. I look up at the seed and I know right away what it is. It seems retarded, but it's the easiest way. I can go out there and I can ID a wild oat more accurately than any of these fancy, that's wild oat, that's barley. I'm going to see for sure. And I think that's a great way of doing it. I don't know that it's all that useful in weed seeds, but I don't think we're used to seeing wheat seeds.
I think anything that has a larger seed, then
Yeah.
that works very well.
Yeah,
so
just
the really tiny seeds, that doesn't work well. But,
Sneaky little trick, hey?
but barley has the large clasping auricles, and wheat has very small clasping auricles, and then wild oat doesn't have any auricles at all. So that sort of helps.
These are the big clasps.
Yeah, good clasp.
Yeah.
So is it wheat?
You want it back? No, it's barley.
Yeah. You failed.
You want it?
But we're a family here, so nobody's gonna tell anyone that you got it wrong, right?
Want to see a little barley?
This was too easy for Ryan. Oh God, you look terrified.
Fantastic.
Is it hairy? That's the first question.
I have no idea.
Who wants an easy one?
Yep.
Oh, you look terrified too.
I just see the weeds. Oh, you need to spray. No idea.
Lamb's quarters, right on.
Well, you know what? It's the grass.
So why don't you then do me a favor and walk into the plot and find me a small one, a really small one.
Can you look on that?
Here's one.
Nice little lamb's quarters for my salad tonight. So some people will eat these in their salad, not bad. So here we got a stinkweed. So
I was surprised to see a lot of little things.
yeah. So the one thing I'll say about broadleaves, I think most of the grasses come out one leaf at a time, and that's pretty obvious. The only sort of confusing thing maybe is that wheat and barley will start tillering around the 4-leaf stage, and so that tiller you don't count as a leaf. So if it says on the label in the crop protection guide spray the 3 to 5 leaf, that tiller you don't count, right? So that's the sort of tricky thing, and so you get up to 3-leaf stage or sometimes the 4, that's no problem. As soon as you get beyond that, then the cereals will be tillering, and you sort of need to discount that. So the other interesting thing about broadleaves is that many will come out at 1 leaf at a time, and so wild buckwheat, if we could find a wild buckwheat here, you'll see. Okay, so you'll see that there's 1 leaf, and then there's another leaf that will come out 4 or 5 days later, whatever. That's a 2-leaf stage.
So here's a baby buckwheat.
There's a baby buckwheat. That's in the cotyledon stage. So all the cotyledons come out as
I dropped my
pears,
big one,
pretty
but
much.
there's one right there.
You tore it off, so it looks small. But what I want to sort of say is that the leaves that many weeds, the leaves come out as a pair of leaves. So then and that's how we'll call it. So we call it 1 pair. But do we call that 2 leaves, or what do we call that? But I also want to say physiologically, it's maybe think of it as a nodes. So the 1 pair of wild mustard, which is 2 leaves, is sort of at the same growth stage as 1 leaf of wild buckwheat, which only has one weed. So think of that a bit as well in terms of the stage. So we can have a wild mustard that looks fairly large, and it's got 2 pairs of leaves, it's got 4 leaves, whatever. But it's sort of like 2 nodes that have leaves on it. It's not necessarily that much more advanced than a 2-leaf stage wild buckwheat. So that's the only thing I would sort of add, sort of in terms of the staging that you go. But you go by the label and the wording in the crop protection guide and how they do that. But it's just sort of sort of in terms of a growth stage or a plant growth stage, what stage you're at. So here's the wild mustard we have here, and so we're
right?
No.
1 or 2. We're sort of coming up into the 3rd pair of leaves here, I guess, which are just come out. Yeah. But it's fairly large already.
In wild mustard too?
Yeah, so we do have resistance in wild mustard. We have, I think in Alberta, we have, I don't know if I want to confuse the issue, but we have about what we call 23 unique weed resistance situations. But how you get to that, if kochia is resistant to group 2 and resistant to glyphosate, that counts as 2. So we don't have 23 weeds, but we have 23 unique situations. But in terms of weeds, we are probably up around 15, 16, 17 weeds or so that have resistance. And then, wild oat, we would have resistance to group 1, we'd have resistance to group 2, we'd have resistance to Avidex. There's still some out there as well. So you get up there. So we do have resistance to wild mustard, and I guess the bigger problem is for the guys growing Clearfield lentil in Saskatchewan, and you might be growing it here as well. But that sort of raised its ugly head in the last few years. I mean, Clearfield was a good development because lentil is so non-competitive and there weren't a lot of herbicides to use, so Clearfield was good. But now there's some fields that look lentil fields look pretty much just totally yellow, and so that's the problem. Cleavers, group 2 resistant cleavers is another concern for many people, and probably, we're not really a cleaver area here, but certainly as you go further north in Alberta and throughout Saskatchewan. And cleavers has come into your area bad? Yeah, okay.
Really?
So it's a nasty weed, nasty weed, and the group 2 resistance is out there and becoming more prevalent, and you can't clean it. It's difficult to clean out a canola seed, right? So that's the problem for lots of people there. Yes?
Sorry, just going back to the wild mustard, were you talking group 9 resistance to that?
No, group 2. Group 2. So group 9, the only one we have in Western Canada is kochia that we know about. And so that's why I want to say that, because people talk about wild oat or talk about something else, and we'll always be 2, 3, 4 years behind finding it, because you might find it if you're out in the field all the time, but really it's usually a producer, a farmer. He or she has to sort of recognize a problem and then contact somebody else. So I took the phone call about kochia. And so Hugh, Becky, and I went down and we went to the farm and we talked to him, and it was pretty obvious he had a problem, and we did all the lab testing to confirm that. But then he sort of says, I've had this problem for 3 or 4 years. So then we put out a press release and we sort of got the word out there, and then Hugh and I were flooded with samples from southern Alberta and in Saskatchewan, all the way to Saskatoon. And so the next year, we had about 100 cases of glyphosate-resistant kochia. So did they all happen in 1 year? No. And we talked to those individual farmers, and he says, I saw it 3 years ago, but it was just small and there wasn't much there, and I sort of didn't really pay attention to it and whatever. So we're always going to be 2, 3, 4 years behind the curve. In terms of identification. So it's really, really important if you have an inkling or a producer has an inkling that you have, glyphosate resistance in, whatever. So we're worried about cleavers. We're definitely worried about wild oat and green foxtail, but it's impossible to predict ahead of time. So, but it's very, very important that if we can identify it sooner, then obviously we can start doing something about it sooner, right?
So Bob, a question. Those tumbling weed, kochia, did they just develop resistance, or they had resistance from the beginning?
Yeah, so resistance, sorry, I'm maybe too loud on that one. The theory is that, there's sort of natural mutations that are happening in the population. So the herbicide does not cause resistance. So that resistant gene is in the population, and then we are just selecting for that resistant gene. So because it survives, so we spray an ugly something on everybody here, and you in the nice yellow shirt, you're the only guy survives. And so all your kids have are resistant, but all of us die. And so then over a few generations, the population has that gene in there. So yeah. So every it depends. Some weeds, like kochia is a bad one. I think. Well, we don't want to go there. So. So anyway, it is an important distinction. Where there's an insecticide or a fungicide or herbicide, they do not cause resistance. They are just selecting for what is occurring out there in the population. But that's changing every year, right? So that low natural mutation rate, I mean, you may not have any in your field in 2014, but you may in 2018. And so that's, biology is not static. It's always evolving, right? Everything's happening all the time.
So Bob mentioned to me the other day too that over the last 10 years we've been pretty wet down here, and just like anything, weeds are adapting to our cropping systems, but they're also adapting to the weather. And he mentioned that's why we're starting to see weeds pop up that we never used to see down here. And What did you say you saw?
Well, I'm writing. Every month I write a little article for Farming Smarter on a weed, and I'm trying to sort of key in on weeds that maybe are not that common here, and maybe could be moving into our area. So my June story is going to be on hemp nettle. And so I was in the process of looking up information, and I was out rating plots here just a couple of days ago. I go through the plots. We've got hemp nettle in the Farming Smarter plots, and so
I've never seen it.
I was very surprised actually to see it in our plots here. It generally likes sort of wetter conditions and cooler conditions and all that stuff, but it's here, right? And I mentioned cleavers, and so I guess it's here, and for some people they have a serious problem already. So. Weeds, they sort of adapt to the climate, and if we have some wetter conditions, then we're going to have hemp nettle. We could have, chickweed, we could have cleavers, we could have some other weeds coming in. Okay, any other questions? Anything else before we need to wrap up soon, Jamie? Right? So
Bob, you mentioned the dealing with the first flush. So if you get something that what comes later, do you just ignore it, or do you be prepared for the second treatment?
I think if you have a really good crop canopy that closes in, you can sort of ignore it, and they'll be there and they'll set some seed, but they're probably not going to cause much of a yield loss, and then I guess there'll be some seed return to the soil, but maybe not as much as you think, and we know in our no-till systems when those seeds are stranded on the soil surface, many of them don't survive the winter. So they desiccate, or they're attacked by fungi, or in some cases they're eaten by ground beetles and things like that. So that's a call that you have to make on your own. I think the Roundup Ready canola systems. I know you paid for your technology use agreement, and you paid for the Roundup relatively cheap. So you think, why not go do a second application? But I think lots of times it's not really merited on a yield loss situation, and every time you spray, it's increased selection pressure for resistance. So you have to weigh that off, and Hector will talk about the same story in terms of insecticides and whatever. It's not just like there's no downside to that, because there is a downside that you have to weigh, balance off on the upside. So Ken, did you want one last second? Did you want to talk about in here?
I want to add a question to Lee's though, because we've been talking about resistance. We're talking about sort of the most economical timing for spraying. And in this case, this is a good example. Canola, we've got a nice second flush of weeds. We do have the technology, we can come in and spray again. But if we're dealing with resistance, it's almost not really an economical question for this year, but for future years. So you kind of get these conflicting messages. So I don't know, how would you suggest you evaluate that and make those types of decisions based on the resistance issue?
Yeah, so that's difficult. If it's a total, second flush and a total carpet of weeds, you maybe need to do something about that, because then if they set seed and a lot of them go to seed, then you're going to have a big population next year. And I just already told you don't really want a zillion weeds out in your field, because that increases your chance of having that resistant gene in the population. So we do want to keep populations at low numbers, but so that's just sort of a trade-off, and maybe it depends on what chemistry you're using and what the weed species is. It is, does that weed have a lot of resistance in it already, I guess?
Mm-hmm. But you can help with that a lot by rotating your crop too. And if next year is not going to use the same chemistry, you can knock it back.
Yeah.
Do you not find, Bob, with our third of a liter typical burn off, just to get everything, now we're bumping to half liter plus adding some additives to get some of our flicks weed, and I think we're kind of creating a monster here. Some of it.
Yeah, so that's a question that comes up all the time, and there's 2 or 3 different mechanisms of resistance. There's the main one is what we call target site resistance, where there's actually a change in the binding site, and so we have a herbicide that comes in and it binds to the enzyme and it no longer works. That enzyme changes, the herbicide comes in, can no longer attach, and so we have high levels of resistance. And so that's sort of a single gene target site, and sort of low rates will not select for that. They're not negative. But we have another mechanism where it's we call it metabolic resistance, and so it's breaking down the herbicide quicker than the herbicide can do its killing action in the plant. And often that is not one gene, it's 2 or 3 genes. And the theory is if you were to spray with sort of lower rates of a herbicide, non-lethal rates, you might allow that plant or that population to accumulate those 2 or 3 genes that are necessary for metabolic resistance. And so that's the story with rigid ryegrass in Australia. It's less of a story for us here, but you know, we do want to have an effective rate of the herbicide. And so whether we've selected for plants, I mean, plants evolve. They can be a little bit more tolerant of the herbicide without really being truly resistant, right? So they're just tougher. They're just naturally tougher to kill, or they're a little bit larger than we spray because we have warmer winters or warmer springs. So I do think that you know, that is the reality. We probably need to spray to a higher rate, and I hope everybody's getting the message that in our burn downs we need to be adding something to the tank with glyphosate.
Some of our burn off we're adding or some of our additives. We're seeing, especially dandelions, where you hit them with fun, kills the top, go back 3 weeks later, and it's coming back through the middle.
Well, that's normal because for most perennials, you just burn off the top growth in the spring, and it'll come back because they have a root system and they just regrow. So for almost all perennials, you have to try and target them in August and September and October, when they're sending food reserves back down to the roots, and the herbicide just goes along for the ride with the sugars and the photosynthate. And then you can get some herbicide movement into the root system. So anytime in the spring, you're just trying to protect crop yield and burn off the tops of perennials, and then try and hit them hard in the fall. Yeah.
I have had pretty decent luck on dandelions in the spring, but you have to up your burn down to at least 1 liter an acre kind of approach, and it's before they're done flowering too. It's kind of a magic window to get dandelions in the spring.
Are you seeing, Ken, sorry, it's changed the subject a little bit because we're talking about glyphosate spraying 1 liter just before the crop pokes up. Are you seeing glyphosate damage on seedlings coming through at all? Just because it's there?
Farming's all about risk management, and if you want to push the edge, yeah.
There's concern about glyphosate, high rates of glyphosate use, I guess just pre-emergence kind of thing. You want to speak on that? Is it better to use lower rates? Is it better to spray earlier, or what's your take on it?
Oh, that was a lot of questions, man. Can you focus it a little?
I know you can. So I don't know. Like, what's your
you're talking about post seed spraying.
Yeah. Like spraying. Like we get really good results spraying just before, say, peas emerge. But is there a risk on hurting those peas? I guess.
That works good with a distral operation, right? You got to watch your seeding tools, eh?
It's all about timing on that one too, right?
Most guys do, and that's the thing. It's a good chance to talk to a lot of farmers here.
Well,
yeah.
You have to wait a certain amount of time because you got to get the weeds to regrow again, right? Because you disturbed it when you planted it. So it's a delicate balance, but it can happen if you didn't have a lot of sunshine, but you didn't have any rain. It's still active on, right? It's still active on the straw.
Yeah, I think there's sort of the thought that glyphosate has no activity in the soil or whatever, and that's not really true. It's tightly bound up to the soil particles, but it's still there. It hasn't degraded yet. And I think what sometimes happens, it can get sort of caught up on the stubble or the straw, and it's going to be. And it's not as tightly bound to that as it is to soil particles. And so if you get a little shower of rain afterwards, you can sort of wash that off. And if you had a little guy just poking through the soil, I think it's possible. So it's not impossible.
I've seen it done safely too at the same time, where you could actually see the crop coming on. And I think it ends up being a bit of a coverage thing. You're not really hitting it. So you're just, it becomes a probability game. So if you don't hit it and it is tightly bound to the soil, you can sometimes get away with it. It's not something I'd want to dabble with too much, but
in the north where the peas are going in so blooming cold that the weeds just aren't really there yet. This is a common tool that they use. They wait 5 days. Get
peas
the weeds
for sure, but now guys are playing around with cereals too, which there is some risk with that, but. It's one of those ones is what are your chances of success? Are you dealing with a mat of resistant wild oats that's already up and at the 3-leaf stage and your crop's just popping up? I've heard some stories from guys able to control it without hurting their crop, but it is, pushing the boundaries on the risk side of things. I was going to say, if there are people here that are wanting to pick up a little bit on the weed ID thing, we can spend a few minutes if you like, and just walk through here. If you find something that you don't recognize, bring it to one of us or Bob, and after that we'll sort of stretch your legs and head off to Hector's session, unless you have any fun comments. Do any of you want to do that, or do you want to move on? Don't care?
Indifferent.
Indifferent? If you want to hone your ID skills, walk forward now.
Maybe that doesn't walk this way.
Okay, we're going to move on then. Thanks a lot, Bob. Maybe join me in thanking Bob.